Okay, I think I'll get started now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so good morning, everybody. It's good to see you virtually. I hope you had a good weekend. I sure enjoyed mine out in the forest and the snow. Um, Anyway, last time Dr. Teresa Ryan spoke with us about Indigenous knowledge and sort of like the worldview of Indigenous science. And she's going to continue on with that and talk more specifically about Indigenous forest practices. Um, if you can call it that, I guess, Indigenous ways of working with the land. Um, and, so her lectures are amazing. And if you missed it, just, yeah, make sure you see these lectures. They're absolutely essential for this course. To show that there's more than one way to look, to see the world, and that it's really important that we embrace and follow in many ways the wisdom of Indigenous knowledge. It really is. Uh, it is like a coming back, if you will, to what we value, and just to recall some of the things that she talked about. About respect is one of the basic principles of Indigenous knowledge. Respect for each other and respect for the land and for all the creatures, all of our relations. Reciprocity, the give and take, that you don't take more than you need, and always give back. The responsibilities to the land and to each other. Um, and being in relationship. This is absolutely essential in how we, interact with forests, is being in relationship with them and all the people who live in and among forests and are interdependent with forests. Those relationships are essential if we're to, really move forward with better stewardship of forests in the world. Um, so I'm going to continue on where I left off last time before Dr. Ryan's lecture. I'm going to finish what I was talking about biodiversity and ecosystem stability, and then I'm going to move into Western forestry practices so that you can have a nice sort of, I don't know, a historical view of where forestry started in British Columbia, or at least the industrial forestry practices, what preceded it, which is Teresa's knowledge and others, and then kind of where we're heading. And, a lot of the rest of the course will be about where we're heading. So I have lots of learning objectives. The first one's about biodiversity and ecosystem stability, and these different types of species groups are going to be the first focus of the first half of the lecture. And then I'm going to talk about the basically Western forest practices and the principles behind it. So I won't go through this in detail, but here we go. I'm going to start with this article that just came out a few days ago on March the 2nd. It's about a paper that was just published in Nature, and there's more and more papers like this coming out all the time, but it says scientists sound the alarm over expected domino effects observed in forests. It's very concerning. So I'll just go through this, what they found. Oops, sorry. Um, and so it goes on, it says, and this is the news article, and you should go look at the actual article if you have time. But the main points here: as temperatures continue to rise due to ongoing climate change, scientists have uncovered an unexpected domino effect that could put forests across North America in danger. Hotter, drier conditions in their study will hinder the growth. So this is getting into the details of how ecosystems work and how all these relationships, if we, to unravel them and understand them, that's really essential in how we manage forests. And we haven't always done this. But okay, let me continue on. Hotter, drier conditions will hinder the growth of a fungus that typically limits the spread of the spongy moth, which is an invasive species that has caused millions of dollars in damage to forests in Canada. While the fungus is a natural combatant that can grow and infect spongy moths before too much damage is done, the reduction in its natural habitat, the reduction of the fungus could lead to a swift turnaround with the moth population and put the forest at significant risk. So as climate's changing, then the fungus is actually being limited by these hot, dry conditions. Remember, fungi love warm, wet conditions, very moist, conducive to fungal growth. And so hotter, drier conditions in forests is leading to reductions in these, and this is affecting this moth, which is an invasive species. And so the scientist says he hopes his research spotlights the importance of taking multiple species, i.e. biodiversity, into consideration when predicting the effects of climate change. The vast majority of previous climate change studies looked at individual organisms, one species or maybe two, but a small amount of climate change can have a big effect when you compound it across multiple species, and ecosystems are made of multiple species interacting. So I thought this was a really good example of why biodiversity on the whole is super important. And when we talk about biodiversity, we can't just look at the overall index of biodiversity, like Shannon's diversity or richness. We actually have to dig down and look at the relationships and what's being affected. And I'm going to come back, to this model that I showed you of how we think about how ecosystems are stable or not. And this is a really useful model. It's just a model. It's been worked on for many years. It still has its flaws, but it's actually a kind of a handy way to think of ecosystems. And so and I'll just go over it again. There's a cup, and that cup is supposed to represent the stability domain of an ecosystem. Like, what is its natural range of variability? What is it normally used to? What is so-called natural? And the cup, sorry, the ball in that cup is the current state of the ecosystem. Is it in an early successional, late successional, old growth? And this concept came, as I mentioned before, came from engineering, which is interesting, that the engineers were on top of ecology. It's probably, one of the few times, but we can borrow from their nomenclature or their vocabulary and adapt it to us. So in engineering, stability, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to diss engineers. They're wonderful, amazing people. But stability is, in an engineering sense, is defined as the speed at which this little ball or the state of the ecosystem returns to its homeostasis, where it's in its happy place in the ecosystem. Is similar to ecological resistance. And I was giving you the example of, a resistant system doesn't change, or it changes a little bit and bounces right back. And you can think of like a tall, stiff tree like Douglas fir. It's got lots of lignin in it. It maintains its really straight, stiff structure. When a wind comes, it resists that wind. It stands up straight. Which is different than resilience, which is like a moving, it kind of moves and recovers. As you've been in the forest, you've seen cedar and hemlock with their floppy tops and floppy branches. They're very supple species, and we say that they're more resilient than Doug fir, which is more resistant to these disturbances. Okay, hopefully that didn't confuse the matter, but those are good ways to think about it. Resistance itself in this cup and ball model is correlated with the depth of the cup, or it represents the depth of the cup. And generally, more productive ecosystems are more resistant to change. They tend to, don't have, like, if you think of a coastal ecosystem, for example, it's not used to tons of fire disturbance, or, there's wind, but not a lot of pathogens, not a lot of insect infestations. They're very resistant, but they're very productive. So they have you can think of the wall, or the depth of that cup is really, really deep. It's very resistant to these ecosystems or to these disturbances. And when they are disturbed, they bounce back really quickly. They reproduce really quickly and become a forest again. Okay, that contrasts with resilience, which is the width of the cup. So resilience in engineering is the amount of energy that the ball or the state of the ecosystem can absorb without leaving the cup. And so if this little ball, leaves the cup, it goes into a whole different domain. So you might think of the current stability domain in this model as the current forest, or the regime of the forest, and an alternative domain would be the forest no longer is a forest because of some catastrophic disturbance or change. Okay, so width of the cup is correlated with resilience, the amount of energy that it takes for it to resist moving into the next cup or that it can absorb is often correlated with biodiversity. So a more diverse ecosystem has got a wide cup. It just means that diverse ecosystems, and you can think of like in back to our first lectures about disturbance in ecosystems that when you have a disturbance that causes a system to go back to secondary succession or primary succession. And then it goes through all these successional stages with many, many species, changing over the distribution over time and over space. So you have lots of opportunities or lots of variability in the species composition. And when you have that high variability, it means that the system itself is resilient. It actually is able to recover really, really well without flipping into an alternative domain, because there's many species that can repopulate and recover that ecosystem. Okay, I hope that's clear. Some people call these cups basins of attraction. And you might hear that term. It just means that an ecosystem or whatever you're talking about in terms of stability is attracted to a certain kind of condition. And you can think in our coastal ecosystems that like the climate really provides that basis of attraction. It's these species, the soils are all attracted to these certain kinds of conditions, or they evolve and are in those conditions. That's what that means. It's a basin of attraction. It draws the ecosystem into what it is. Okay, so let's go back, now that this model is in your heads. Let's talk about this biodiversity and then how it plays into ecosystem stability in a more granular way. And I'm going to talk about three things: efficiency of resource uses, stabilization of variable climates, and then insurance against radical changes. So let's go through each of those. So a lot of this work, and I'm going to show you, this is an experiment that was done in the US. I think it was in Wisconsin by a famous ecologist named David Tillman. And he did this experiment on the idea that, species diversity might affect ecosystem processes and therefore productivity. And in this agricultural field, he planted sort of like herbaceous species, and he kept adding more and more species to his treatment. So each of these little squares is a treatment, and it's got different numbers of species that he's added into it. Okay, so from no species diversity, so that would be these bare plots, there's nothing there, all the way to, very high diversity, which could be these like very dark spots. Okay, so this is a famous experiment. And essentially what he found, and I think I've shown you this before, is that ecosystem productivity and ecosystem function increases as species richness increase or as diversity increases. So, in this picture on the right, you can see this very diverse herbaceous meadow here compared to some that have maybe one or two species in them. And so he found, yes, that as you added more and more species, that productivity increased. But then, it started to level off at a certain point because of this redundancy or overlap in ecosystem niche or niche of the species themselves. Okay, so and he went and he measured that one of the reasons that these diverse communities were more productive is because they had a greater that the more species that there was, the more species richness, the more they used available resources in the community. So in this graph, what he did is he went down into the soil and he took samples in these different plots with different numbers of species from 5 to 25 or 0 to 25. And he took soil and he measured the nitrate content in the soil. And he was trying to correlate that with, if the lower the nitrate content in the soil, the more full uptake of nitrate there was. And so what he found is that at high species richness, from about 8 onward, that the nitrate was all taken up. And so he found very little in the soil. As we reduced species to 1 or a 0, there was very little uptake of that nitrate. And so he measured high levels in the soil. Okay, so what it's telling us is that as we increase species richness, all those species are working together to absorb or take up that nitrate that's available in the soil. So it's a more complete use of the available resources with high species diversity that he measured. Okay, so now how does this happen? In this case, and it's because of this more full resource uptake. And so this is an example of niche complementarity where the species, and we've got two flowers here. I know that it says strangers on one, but these are just two flowers. Think of them as two different species. They are strangers, they're different species, and they're able to use resources differentially. In this case, we've got one species here on the left that's got deep roots and the one on the right that's got shallow roots, and they're accessing resources or nitrate, if you will, in these different levels or these different depths in the soil profile. And by doing that, they can avoid competing with each other, or they at least reduce their competition with each other, and they more fully take up that nitrate. So they're using different soil horizons in this case. They might even go after different things like different nitrogen compounds. Maybe one is good at nitrate and one's good at taking up ammonium. Maybe they'll have different canopy positions taking up light in different wavelengths or at different amounts. They might flower in different times of the season, and so we avoid each other over time. So this is what we call niche complementarity. So my question is next, how does species diversity result in increased resource use? And it is because they're complementary. There's niche complementarity. So here's a polling question.
Start. Done. It's perfect.
Okay, good. Thanks, everybody. Yeah. Okay. So another second reason, sorry, I'm always trying to get rid of in my own screen. I've got all these things that interfere with me being able to see my full screen. So the second reason is that diversity stabilizes ecosystems when there's change over time. So if we have, so in this case, this upper picture is like a very diverse forest. It's a tropical rainforest. Let's say that, one of those species is very, very sensitive to drought. Well, there's lots of other species in this mixed forest that would not be sensitive to drought, say at a certain time of year. And so they can compensate for each other. So if one is kind of shrinking back because it's dried out or suffering from drought, the other ones will expand their crowns and expand their rooting area so that they can more fully take up the resources. So they compensate each other over the course of the year. And this is because of their different abilities, really their different niches and abilities to tolerate resource limitations differently. Another example down below, you can see here there's a pine forest that's mixed with some fir, so the red trees are lodgepole pine, the green ones are fir and spruce. And this is a good example of in the mountain pine beetle, which swept through British Columbia in North America in the 1990s and killed 18 million hectares of trees, basically. But there were always some trees left behind because the firs and the spruces, in this case, are not susceptible to mountain pine beetle. So those species were able to, were not affected, and they were actually able, in a lot of cases, to expand their influence on the ecosystem and maintain a productive ecosystem. So the question is, how does species diversity stabilize ecosystem processes?
Start. So 55% E, but 30% A, and remain spread in BCD.
Yeah, so that was a bit of a tricky question. I didn't mention, so it's all of the above. And yeah, each species has specific tolerances, herbivores, predators. And one thing I didn't mention, which is, this is why it was tricky, is that, species can protect each other against these infections or extreme events too. They can shade, they can share resources through their networks or root systems. There are all kinds of mechanisms that they work together to protect each other. Okay, so it's actually all of the above, but thanks. Okay, now the third one, that diversity also protects against or provides insurance against extreme events or new conditions. So uh, if you have a diverse ecosystem like the one down here, there's another nice diverse forest. It says any change, and this is kind of related to the last one, but this is more about extreme events, not just, normal predators and herbivores and, normal tolerances. But when we have extreme events like, a heat dome or an unexpected snowfall in spring, or, we're getting more of these. Uh, it's unlikely that when you have a diverse group of species, diverse numbers of species, that these climate extremes could cause a local extinction of one species, but it's unlikely it's going to eliminate all species from a functional group. And I'm going to go into what functional groups are in a second, but they're basically groups of species that perform similar functions. So if you have a whole bunch of species in a group, like say all good at taking up nitrogen, or good at fixing nitrogen, and you've got 10 of them and one of them gets really hammered by that extreme climate event like a heat dome. Well, there's another 10 that are still in there doing that nitrogen fixation and so on. So this is really specifically about very extreme events. And by having multiple species in functional groups, it spreads the risk. And this is again gets back to this insurance hypothesis that multiple species within a functional group spreads the risk. Okay, so the polling question here then is, how does species diversity provide insurance? Oh, and before I do there, I'll just dissect this graph for you. This just shows species richness before a drought, and then you have a drought, and it shows the drought resistance that you have. Sorry, I didn't look at this beforehand, but as you're increasing the number of species, the resistance of the entire community goes up, right? Because you've got multiple species that have these drought resistance. Okay, so let's go. Well, how does species diversity provide insurance?
Start. Yeah, that's perfect. And also, there's a student asking, can you re-explain the part of spreaking risk?
Can I which?
There's a question say, can you re-explain the part about spreaking risk? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So when you have extreme risk, so something that's outside the range of natural variability, something that is, like when we had the heat dome in 2021, I believe it was, where, we had this high pressure system that's set up over the Pacific Northwest, and it stayed for many, many days in a row. And people were dying, their forests were dying. We're still seeing the impacts of that. When you have a diversity of species in the forest, there's going to be some that are very, very, very drought tolerant, and then others that aren't. And so if you've got a group that are drought tolerant, that different degrees of drought tolerance, there's probably one species in there, at least one or a few, that are going to be able to resist that extreme event. And so it is really important to have this variety of species as we're getting into more and more extreme events, that it really is hedging our bets that something is going to be able to survive that very extreme thing. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it helped because I a student just typo it's spreading risk. I'm just asking what is spreaking risk. But yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
perfect.
Okay. Okay. So just some generalities, in summary of these points, that declining richness or diversity, if you will, which includes richness and abundance, leads to declining productivity and stability. And this is especially true in systems where there's low natural diversity anyway. Okay, they're even more at risk. That to maintain productivity, you need at least one species. And this is, I'm going to talk about this in a sec, in a functional group. A functional group is like a group of species that perform similar functions, like drought resistance or ability to take up nitrate. So you need at least one species in each of these functional groups. And that the nature of the decline as we lose species, as we drive species to extinction or reductions anyway, the nature of that decline really depends on what species is lost. Not all species are kind of created equal in that group, that functional group. Okay, so what is a functional group? A functional group is a group of species that share similar traits and have similar effects in ecosystem processes. For example, a trait could be that they're similarly competitive for light. They're similarly tolerant of drought stress, similarly tolerant of nitrogen, low nitrogen availability. Similar, there's a bunch that are very invasive, a whole bunch that can fix nitrogen. I'll give you an example, like in the forest where you're working, taking your photos, there are, some nitrogen fixing species. There's alder, obviously, it's the biggest nitrogen fixing species, but there's also some legumes in there. So low growing natural native plants, lupins that can also fix nitrogen. So you've got a few in that group, that functional group called nitrogen fixation that can perform that function. And here, there's a few more here. There was an ecologist, or maybe I guess he was more like a plant biologist, another famous guy from England. His name was Grime, and he put plants in the UK into different functional groups. And he organized them according to whether or not they were capable of tolerating stress. Think of drought stress. Or were they good competitors? Or were they good invaders? And some of them landed in multiple groups. So here he organized all these species and it was in his neighborhood. He probably went out and studied the plant communities in where he lived. Um, and and he found that, there's a certain group, and he put them all in this big triangle according to their relative ability to withstand stress. He called them stress tolerators. He called the ones that were good at invasion, the R, which are called ruderels. Ruderel just means invasive or quickly inhabiting. And then the ones that are all just really good competitors, he put them up here in the top of the triangle. And then he organized all these species in this little matrix and said, that this is where they fall in their functional groups. And so going back to, when you're thinking of making sure your ecosystem, when we're working with diversity, let's say you're a manager and you're trying to manage basic diversity of the forest, there's a good principle is to make sure that there is at least one species and preferably multiple species in each one of these functional groups. Grimes was just one, imagination of these different groups. There's others have done this in different ways. So this is really helpful in predicting if we lose a species, what will happen. And it also helps us, draw generalities. If we have a bunch of species in this group, if we make sure that they're there, we can generally say, that we think that this system is going to be stable. Okay, now, not all species behave the same, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how these different species with different functions, how they can affect ecosystem processes. So I'm just showing you on the right here, we've got this figure that I showed you before. This is Tillman's figure of all of his different plant communities. And he said ecosystem function and productivity is a function of species diversity. But it depends on what species. If you're starting to lose species from that diverse community, it depends on what species you lose, right? So there are, generally, we can say that if a species is very rare, even though it's, oops, sorry, if it's very rare, that means that as you lose these rare species, generally, because there's not very many of them, and they're not having a huge influence on that ecosystems, that you can lose some of these rare species and not lose a whole bunch of ecosystem processes. But if it's a dominant species, so in this case on the left, we have this lodgepole pine forest hit by the mountain pine beetle below. It's a dominant species. And if the beetle kills off all the dominant species and it's comprising 90% of the forest, the impact on the ecosystem process is enormous, right? So it's not just the functional group, it's also their dominance that is really, really important about which ones you might lose. And so when you're thinking of managing, you want to make sure not only do you have multiple functional groups, but your dominant species are also in good shape so the system can maintain function. A dominant species is a species whose architecture and functional ecology define the forest structure and whose species-specific traits control ecosystem dynamics. Their functions are irreplaceable by other trees in the system. I'm going to, just to riff off on this lodgepole pine example. So lodgepole pine, in which is this forest down below in this picture, it's a fire adapted species. So, and fire occurs in our landscapes on a regular basis. These are, fire adapted ecosystems for regular return of fire. Lodgepole pine in particular, its cones only open when they're heated up by fire. And when their cones heat up, they open and the seeds fall out and it repopulates to lodgepole pine. The other species, their cones like spruce and fir, which are less abundant in here, they don't do that. They burn up in the fire for the most part. And so lodgepole pine is adapted. It's absolutely essential to the recovery of the system following fire. Okay, so its function is irreplaceable by the other two species in this ecosystem. So it's a dominant, or some people call them foundational species. Okay, now there's other species types that that you can have some species. So this is looking at the lower figure on the lower right, and you can see compensating species and keystone species. So compensating species are species that are kind of lower down in the food chain that have that actually work together. They can compensate for each other's functions. They're in these functional groups. And you can lose some of these species. So without a whole lot of reduction in ecosystem processes in theory. But if you lose something called a keystone species is a species that is at the top of the food chain. Usually they have low abundance, but what they do, the top predator, affects the entire food chain all underneath it. So if we lose those keystone species, the function of the ecosystem also declines. Okay, so what are keystone species? Sorry. These are species or groups of species whose processes are more important than their abundance might suggest. They include things like wolves and grizzly bears at the top of the food chain. Keystone is named after Roman architecture, actually. If you've ever been to Italy and you've seen the Colosseum and you can look at those beautiful archways with that, incredible history there, that those archways were built by engineers, of course, or designed by engineers, and the keystone is that stone at the top of the arch that if you took out that keystone, the whole arch would fall down, right? It's absolutely key to the functioning of the arch. So it's been adopted from, again, another term adopted from engineering. So keystones play a pivotal role in ecosystem processes. If you remove them, it significantly alters all the trophic levels below. Okay, so polling question 10, which type of species will cause the greatest loss in function?
Start. Done. It's perfect.
Okay, good. Good work, everybody. Okay, so just to go over again, this cup and ball model, then I hope that now you're starting to get a good sense that when you have a system that's got a wide cup with lots of species, where the width is represented by species, or you can think of it as successional stage, like I've shown here along the bottom. Those systems that are used to a lot of disturbance, they have a lot of species in them, that they have better resilience. They're able to recover better and maintain function and productivity. Okay. So this model gets a little, we can make it as complicated as we want, and people do, of course. So I'm just going to make it a little more complicated with this figure. This is you can see on the right-hand side, A and B, that A, we look at A, people talk about not just resilience and resistance, they talk about recovery and response. So let's go through what those are. A response is really just when your ecosystem, in this case, you've got this little dashed ball at the bottom, the original state. There's a disturbance. Maybe there's a small fire. The state of the ecosystem, you lose some trees, some species, are reduced a lot. The ball or the state of the system moves a little bit. And in this case, it's going to recover very quickly because it didn't lose much. And so the response is this amount, the recovery is the same amount in the reverse direction, and the overall resilience of this little system is this wide. Okay, so the recovery then, so response, the magnitude of change, recovery, the extent of the return to the original. And again, resistance, the ability of the system to absorb these small disturbances and prevent amplification. So this was a very resistant system. It had small disturbance, but a high resistance to moving. In B, it's quite a different thing. We've got a big disturbance, or the system might have very low resistance, right? The species cannot resist. Maybe they're very resilient and can recover quickly, but they can't resist. Maybe they don't have thick bark if it's a fire, or they have shallow roots that burn easily. So in this case, we have a disturbance that's quite large. The original state gets hit pretty hard. It goes all the way, into this, and you've got a bumpy cup here. Maybe there's several different domains of attraction. Like maybe you can have, like, it can look different under different climatic conditions, but still be within the normal range of distribution, but it's a bit bumpy. In this case, we've got a big disturbance. The ball goes all the way up here, almost flipped into a next domain, another kind of ecosystem, but it doesn't. It recovers, and it recovers down to here. Instead of to the original, maybe it recovers to, instead of being an old growth forest, now it's a lodgepole pine forest. We say this system, because it was able to recover quite a bit with this large disturbance, it actually has high resilience. It moved, so it had low resistance, but it recovered quickly, so it has high resilience. Okay, yeah, it's a little, okay, so here it says if it moved back to just this substate, it would have had low resilience. If it moved all the way back to the original state, then it was high resilience. Okay, I hope that this is getting clear. Okay, so here we have a system, two kinds of ecosystems, one that's got multiple species. These are boreal forests. The one on the left, you've got lots of clusters of aspen and spruce and some pine and whole mixed forests. And then on the right, you have all lodgepole pine, basically. So we can say that the one on the left, it has high resistance. If a fire goes through or the beetle goes through, it doesn't get very far because there's many species that are resistant to that fire or that insect infestation. Whereas if you have a very uniform landscape with lots of lodgepole pine in this case, the beetle moves through like wildfire. And so low resistance is where we have a uniform landscape that's uniform in species, generally the age and genetics, that all increases the risk of a catastrophic disturbance. Okay, so we also can change the risk in our of us flipping into a whole different ecosystem state. We can change the resistance of that ecosystem by changing all kinds of things. So, for example, in this example above, we've got arboreal forest, mixed boreal forest. Well, at the turn of the late 1800s, a lot of the landscape in British Columbia, for example, was burned during white settlement period. And then the stands all came back to relatively pure lodgepole pine. And then we adopted these fire suppression policies and banned indigenous burning. And so we created this huge carpet of same-aged lodgepole pine over a huge area in BC. And so in essence, we went from our here regime A, or an A, example A at the top here, a normal system, the ball is like moving back and forth, like on the far left. It's doing great. It's able to recover lots of species. But then we came in, we burnt everything, and then we suppressed fire, and we actually the resistance of the system actually started to decline. And this is depicted in this model by the depth of the cup got more shallow. Okay, and then therefore it's easier to pop that ball out into a new stability domain. And we didn't, we added onto this then. When the beetle came through, we did a bunch of salvage logging, which further decreased the resilience of the ecosystem. We replanted it back to lodgepole pine again. And then, in these dead, very flammable forests, dying and flammable forests created higher fire risk. And in adding all of these cumulative effects on each other, we essentially changed the system so it was really easy for the ball to flip into a whole new stability domain. And so, they talk about in our boreal forest that through these multiple actions that we've actually reduced the resistance and the resilience, and it's easier to flip into a whole different regime. Okay. Or we can have massive disturbance like these mega fires that can just do it all on its own. But that would be C. Okay, what changed in the beetle outbreak to cause a regime shift? Let's see what our choices are here.
Okay, let's start. So we have 70% of D, but like there's 20% in A, 10% for B and C.
Okay, yeah. No, this is another tricky question. So yeah, we did change biodiversity. It was also accelerated by climate change, which I didn't mention. But the mountain pine beetle outbreak did also result from warmer warmer temperatures. And then we also had, with the dying trees, this increase in fuel loads. So good for you, for all of you who thought critically that it is D. But these other questions, A, B, or C were also, would be correct, but you get full marks for D. You might see this question show up again in an exam at the end of the course. Okay. So, when we're looking at these regime shifts, then with the cup and ball model, we can have regime shifts by, A, on the left, we can have a shift in what they're called in this figure, the variables, and this could be disturbance severity. So as we reduce biodiversity, increase fuel loads, and change climate, especially increasing fuel loads and reducing biodiversity, those big shifts mean that it's a lot. When that disturbance happens, the fires, the huge mega fires, or the beetle kill, they're hitting these ecosystems really hard. It's very, very severe disturbances. So high disturbance severity, changing disturbance regime can cause this A shift in variables. Shift in parameters means that the actual shape of the cup changed. It's not just what hit the ball in the cup. It's the whole cup changed. And this is happening with things like climate change. As climate changes, our forests are just, the cup's not very deep anymore. They're just not very resistant to these big climatic extremes. Okay, let's see what we have next. So this is just kind of a summary slide before we have a break. Sorry about this. Changing conditions can cause the decline of local biodiversity. If this happens, an ecosystem's resistance or resilience may decline. The end result is that the ecosystem loses stability. And ecosystems that are less stable may not be able to respond to a normal disturbance, which may damage the ecosystem, the function. It can shift it into a whole different regime. Okay, so polling question 6. What is the best way to avoid regime shifts in ecosystems?
Start. So 15% for AEC, around 60% in D, and 30% in E.
Okay, yeah, so D is the right answer. Maintaining biodiversity is essential. Mitigating climate change is the most important thing that we could do, right? We can adapt, yeah, but if climate continues to change at a rapid pace, really these systems are going to change in a dramatic way. So the answer is D. I know that was a tricky question. Okay, so I know, I'm gonna take a break now, but this is just a little summary of this little section, and I'm gonna move on to another topic after our break. But stable systems maintain structures and functions over long periods of time and despite normal disturbances. Diversity is generally correlated with stability. This is due to enhanced resource use, buffering against temporal variation, and insurance against extreme events. The effect of reduced diversity depends on what species it is, foundational, rare, keystone, and so on. And shifts in variables or parameters can lead to regime shifts. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with that, and we'll see you at 12 and have a little break. Okay, thanks. Okay, hi everybody, welcome back. So I'm gonna shift now to talking about forest practices. And I mentioned that Teresa is going to be coming back on Wednesday to talk about Indigenous science and Indigenous practices in forests. I really want you to think about this, like what's happened over the last century and where we need to go to protect forests and therefore mitigate climate change and biodiversity loss, since most carbon in the world, 80% of terrestrial carbon is in forests, 80% of species diversity is in forests. So here I'm bringing up an article that was published way back, like over 10 years ago, by World Resources Institute. If you're not familiar with them, they do reporting out on global issues every year, like the global state of things. And so back in 2014, they were announcing that and I'm just going to read, the world's virgin forests are being lost at increasing rates, and the largest proportion of the degradation is in Canada, according to their report at that time. And they were using satellite imagery to look at, compare Canada with all the different countries. And they said no longer is Brazil the main villain in the struggle to stop deforestation and or destruction. And you might recall in Brazil at that time, they had a government that was really, doing a lot basically of converting the Amazon rainforest to agricultural fields. And so this was huge, and it was in the news. I think most people at the time, we were always like, oh, Brazil is the worst. But in fact, Canada was like doing its own thing up here. These scientists found that the pace of decline has been accelerating, that about 8% of global undisturbed forests have been lost from 20 over a 13-year period. In particular, the boreal forest has been, devastated by the oil sands in one thing. As one example, wildfires since then, you remember the big Fort McMurray fire, that's been since this article came out. And of course, logging is the other thing. The northern boreal forest belt that runs primarily through Canada and Russia, plus Brazil's Amazon, represents 65% of the world's remaining virgin forests, primary forest. Some 47% of this degradation has occurred in the boreal forest and only 25% in the Amazon. And this was, as I said, 2014. The same trends are happening. We're still Canada and Russia. We don't know much about the state of Russia forests, but Canada's forests definitely are still being disturbed at an unprecedented rate. Okay, how did we get there? How did we get here? Let's go through a little bit of forest management history. So 10,000 years ago, way before colonialism, indigenous people lived on this land had been living here for 10 to 16,000 years since the last ice age. Um, you know, indigenous governance and stewardship was based on their principles of respect, reciprocity, responsibility in good relation with all relations. Tech is traditional ecological knowledge. They basically, used science, indigenous science, to figure out how to make sure those ecosystems were productive and stable to provide for people for, over long periods of time. Um, and when North Americans or when Europeans came to North America, what they found were these beautiful ecosystems with beautiful cultures, and thought that these were pristine ecosystems that untouched by humans, which was not true. In fact, that the indigenous people had been stewarding these forests for thousands of years through things like using fire, indigenous burning to enhance biodiversity, for example, reducing fuel loads, for example, managing the fisheries to ensure there were high abundance of salmon and clams using these methodologies that Dr. Ryan discussed last time. Um, and one of the most important principles that I've mentioned, and she has too, is this principle of reciprocity. And that is that Aboriginal people or Indigenous people, they're taking care of each other. And that is the most important thing. And it's not just reciprocity among people, but between people and all relations, the trees, the salmon, the water, the rocks. Okay, so I'm just going to come back. Like, what is this principle? And do we practice this in forest management now? I mean, I would argue that we don't. We take more than we put back. And so, okay, so it's really important that we understand this principle. So I'm going to give you a polling question. What is the principle of reciprocity?
Oh, hmm. And so, oh, interesting. So, like, there's 30% students choose two.
Yeah, it's a similar concept. So I'll just distinguish what that means then. Tit for tat means, do unto others what you want done to yourself. It's sort of like, it's like this equal balance. In fact, in the reciprocity principle, it is helping each other, but it's always giving back a little bit more. So I'm going to expand on this idea, what Teresa called the gift economy, what Robin Wall Kimmerer writes in her books about the service barrier based on the gift economy, is that you actually give a little bit more to make sure that that there's enough. So it's not just tit for tat, it's actually, a little bit more than that. So I know that was hard, but I'm, use it as a chance to teach a little bit more about this. It's giving a bit more than you would take. Okay, so and as I said, when colonization of North America happened, people came and they saw this great abundance in the landscape and didn't understand that there were these principles and stewardship at work, and have been for thousands of years. They just saw what they thought were pristine environments, beautiful rivers, beautiful forests. Um, but on the right, you have a number of elders, probably some chiefs, community members, and I've been so fortunate in some of my travels with Indigenous people is to witness this act of reciprocity and respect, that in entering a forest to pick berries or to harvest medicines, or to manage the forest for maybe elk or moose or bear. When they enter the forest, they sing a song to ask permission to come in. And here you have drums, and they probably were drumming and singing, asking permission and showing respect, and then receiving the answer and then acting based on the answer. If the answer is no, we've got beetles, we've got climate change, we've got drought. If the forest is telling us, then you don't come into that forest that day, or you take less and you give back more to make sure the forest is able to reproduce itself. So these are, true acts of respect and reciprocity. Okay, so what happened in North America? As time went on, in the 1800s, basically in the mid 1800s, when explorers started arriving in British Columbia or in Canada, they started, small, of course, not very many people, but basically hunting for furs, trading. Um, but in that process, there was an enormous appetite for furs and wood and in Europe, and for sailing ships, and this was starting to, be a little bit, there's some exploitation going on, and actually removing indigenous people from their resources and their land, so they were not able to carry out their responsibilities to caring for the land. And then as time went on, there was very, very little regulation happening. Down below here is actually a picture of what my town used to look like 100 years ago. Now it's surrounded by forest. But this is classic in British Columbia, where in this white settlement period, the fires that burnt the forest down looking for ore. In my town, they were looking for silver and gold, and burnt the forest down looking for this so they could ship them back to Europe and to build the economy of what would become Canada. So there was very minimal regulation, and the cutting down of enormous trees, and this continues to this very day. Just goes to show how large these trees were that had been cared for and stewarded for so long. So, sorry, I'm going to keep moving. So as time went on, there started to be some regulation, because these cutting of these big old trees led to, in the 1970s, clear cutting, massive clearing. You can see this in this lower picture. This is on Vancouver Island, near Mears Island. And there were a lot of protests that happened. And as a result, they started to regulate the forest management. They started to regulate this pressure, drove the government to start regulating the cuts. Even more pressure through the Clyde Sound protests. They moved into not even just regulating the cutting, but actually considering multiple uses of the forest. They called it multiple use management or integrated resource management. And there were all these planning tables and local communities coming together and say, hey, we don't want you to cut down all the forest. We actually need forest to regulate our water supply, for example. We need forest for animals and for our livelihoods. And eventually moved to something called ecosystem-based management, but it really was still very timber focused. And then in 2021, in Dr. Ryan, I'm sure we'll talk about this. The United Nations wrote the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This was legislated into the DRIPA, Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People Act in British Columbia. And this requires now that, that when there is harvesting, that there's consultation with First Nations, and that instead of just exploiting for timber, that we actually account for multiple values in the ecosystem, biodiversity, for example, food systems. So we're moving in that direction, but it's a back and forth. It's not a smooth transition. There is still this timber focus in ecosystem management in British Columbia. And you can see this. This is a figure actually from a professor in the Faculty of Forestry during her PhD, Shannon Hagerman, who looked at the harvesting timber volume from the beginning of the 1900s, and how, it was this unregulated period, and then they started to formalize some kind of regulated process, which was based on this idea that you were only going to harvest as much that would continue to yield forests for wood into the future in perpetuity, and entered into this regulation period of about, what is this, about 30 years, But you can see that the rate of harvest kept going up and up and up, and eventually sort of kind of to stabilize at this very high level of between 60 and 90 million cubic meters per year. That's a large amount of forest harvesting. So where are we now? We've gotten to this point here where this is in 2002 that the harvest has actually come down to about 45 million cubic meters. And the reason is mainly because they basically cut down too much forest in this whole period, and went whoops. And we've got climate change and fires and beetle. Whoops, now we don't have the wood. We basically don't have the wood to cut all that forest. Okay, so I'm going to continue on a little bit with this history. How we got to this situation. How is land governed in Canada? Who owns this land? It was arguably, Indigenous land forever until colonialism happened and there was a declaration this was going to be British rule. And then they called it, the land Crown land. It was under the rule of the king. And it's still called Crown land today. And today, 93% of land is considered to be public land or Crown land. There's more private land in Eastern Canada, but in the West, it's mostly Crown land. This land, the forests are governed and managed by the provinces and the territories, not by the federal government, which oversees all of Canada, but each province has jurisdiction over the management of its crown land. Okay, so how does it do this? Well, it grants things called tenures. It's kind of like renting out the forest to private companies, and they transfer the rights to that timber to these private companies. Companies like Western Forest Products or Canfor, Canadian Forest Products, or Interfor, all kinds of them. Of course, this is all under rapid change right now. There's a lot of pressure to reverse some of these timber rights away from private interests back to the people. There's pressure from just regular folks saying, hey, we don't like what's happening on our forests. There's too much clear cutting and so on. And of course, Indigenous people have the right through DRIPA to have free, prior, and informed consent over anything that happens on unceded territories, and which is a right. We need to have their oversight and stewardship back on the land. So this is all a very fluid and dynamic situation. So this map down below here just shows in British Columbia, you can see that this is almost all Crown land. Over much of Canada, there are various treaties that have been settled. There's, treaty settlement is way behind in the West. But this will all, I think, will happen it's going to keep happening. It's good for forests. So, okay, so how do the provinces then? Remember, the provinces and territories manage the Crown land and what the harvesting rate is on Crown land. What they do is they set something called the allowable annual cut. The allowable annual cut is the amount of timber that they say can be harvested on a sustainable basis within a defined forest area, which they call a timber supply area. I know this is a lot of jargon, but just think about it. It's just the amount of cut that can be done each year, and to ensure that you can always go back and find more wood to cut in perpetuity, because forests do grow back. So if you have like a forest that grows for 100 years, it means that you could cut about 1% of that forest every year for those 100 years, and then come back and recut it again each piece in 100 years. Okay, the AAC is measured in cubic meters of wood. It's based on what the forest will grow, how much it will grow back each year. Foresters use a whole variety of tools to figure out what this AAC is, allowable annual cut. They use something called permanent sample plots where they measure forest growth. They use statistics in all kinds of ways and computer models to predict future growth. The AAC is all based on what happened in the past, not what happened in the future. So these sample plots measured past forest growth, and they use that growth in the past to calculate what they can cut in the future. Okay, so the AAC principle is based on sustained yield. Okay, so here's a polling question.
Art. Like 60% got correct, but like still 30% of students they choose E, C, and D.
Yeah. So you know what? You're all correct. The sustained yield is the purported reason. That is what, is legislated. But economic profit always sort of changes our vision of sustained yield. So both of them are at play here. So you're not completely wrong. Okay, I'm going to stop now because it's 20 after, and I will pick this up after Dr. Ryan's lecture on Wednesday. But yes. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day. Thank you.